Hello class, welcome to chapter 10, Measuring a Nation's Income.
So remember, we have learned that for economics, it includes both the microeconomics and the macroeconomics. For microeconomics, you study how household and firms they interact with each other in the market. So for macroeconomics, usually we investigate individuals, either firms or household. But for macroeconomics, so we study the economy-wide phenomenon. We study the economy as a whole, as a general definition. And usually it includes inflation, unemployment, and economic growth. If we want to investigate the general definition, we need to have some indicators to manage this macro economy, right? So what indicator we need to use is the GDP, the gross domestic product. The gross domestic product measures the total income of everyone in the economy, and it also measures total expenditure on the economy's output of goods and services. So here, I marked it here. Income equals expenditures. Because in our society, if you want to have some service or good, you pay the money. But for the other part, they have to receive the same amount of money you pay. So in this case, for the whole society, the income for the servicers or for the people who provide the good, they are going to get the same amount of money as you pay them, right? So because every dollar a buyer spends is a dollar of income for the seller. Okay, here is an example. Nella pays James $50 to mow her lawn. So what happens with the total expenditure? Expenditures. Remember, income should be equals to the expenditure. So for Nella, she pays this amount of money. So that's the expenditures for Nella. But for James, that's the income for James because he gives the service, right? So the total income should also equal to $50. So again, income equals the expenditure. Total expenditure rises by 50%, that's $50, and also the same total income rises by $50. This is the picture we have learned. It's the circular flow. First of all, we have the assumption, right? So there are only two parts, two players in this model. There are firms and households. The circular flow diagram is simply a depiction of the macroeconomy and illustrate the GDP as spending, revenue, factor, payment, and income. So as GDP, usually we use money to measure GDP. So money, which means either income or expenditures. Income also equal to expenditures. So from this model, we can see that in the market for goods and services, product market, the buyers are household. So buyers are going to pay the money. So this green line is the expenditures for household. And that's equals to the amount of income. The income is for the firms, because firms are going to provide the goods or services. So the income equals to expenditures here. That's part of GDP, right? And the same, in market for factors of production, the firms are going to hire people, hire workers, and all rent capitals, buildings to do the production. So in this market, firms are going to pay wage, rent, or other things to household. So that's the amount of money, that's the cash flow or flow of dollars, will be the expenditures for firms. But this amount of money is also equals to the income of the household when we give the laborers' time of work or rent their lands or capitals or whatever. So these two equal to each other as well, and also this is also a part of GDP. But what this diagram all means, like as I said, for economic model, usually we have some assumptions to make that model easier for us to understand. And also in this model, the assumption is we only have two parts, which are firms and households in this market. That's easier for us to investigate what's the economy or how money flow or transaction in this model. But what this diagram all means is the government, right? Because in mixed economy, back to that definition, for market economy, only household and firms are could make the decision in that market. But for the mixed market or mixed economy, the government should play a huge role in that market. So, which means in the circular flow, we omit the government's roles. So, what the government usually do is collects taxes, buys goods and services. And another item we omit is the financial system in this market. So the financial system matches the savers' supply of funds with the borrowers' demand for loans, and also the foreign sector. Trade goods and services, financial assets and currencies with the country's residents. So these three parts, that's what we omit from the circular flow, and also that's our assumption that only these two parts. We give up three other parts in this market. The next part is the definition for gross domestic product, GDP. So it's the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. So there are a couple of words I want to emphasize here. First of all is the market value. Right. The market value should be the goods are valued at their market price. And all goods measured should be in the same units. We cannot measure different goods, one with US dollars and the other maybe with Japanese yen, right? We should measure them with the same unit. So in our class, we usually use dollars to measure them. So it should be the market value. Things that don't have a market value are excluded. This is a really important part. So how housework you do for yourself or the work you do for your family, your husband, your wife, or your friends, any work, if you cannot see money there, if there is no money flow, then that part will not count as GDP. Any work or value you need to count as GDP, it should have the market value. You can see how much money there. If you can see no money, which means it's not GDP. All right? The next part. The next word is important is all here. GDP. GDP includes all products, all items produced in the economy and sold legally in the market. So everything legally is important. GDP excludes most items produced and sold illicitly. It also excludes from, so the first one, if anything is illegal, then that will not count in the GDP. Such as heroin, right? That's illegal in all countries. So any transaction of that, although you can use money to measure how much money you sell or buy or whatever, but since it's illegal, it will not count as GDP. And the second sentence is, it also excludes most items that are produced and consumed at home. So the second sentence It's kind of the same as the last slide. If you produce or consume at home, which means you do not need to pay money or receive some income from that part. So if you see no money, then any actions will not count as GDP. So it should be all goods and all legally goods or services in the market. The next important word is the final goods. Final goods means intended for the end user. It should be the end user. For example, like I'm a farmer for the orange. I can sell my orange to the consumers. They just want to eat the orange. But there is another type of consumers. They are the orange juice companies. They buy the orange not for eating. They buy that for the intermediate goods, right? They want to use orange to produce their final product, which is the orange juice. So in that case, the consumer who are going to buy the orange are the end user, but not the orange juice companies. So final goods should be intended for the end user, and the intermediate goods used as components or ingredients in the production of other goods. GDP only includes final goods. They already embody the value of the intermediate goods used in their production. Okay, such as I'm the farmer. I sell orange to the consumers for such as $200. Sell to the consumers. And I sell $300 to the companies, consumers, and the companies. So in this case, this $200 should count as GDP, right? Because that's a sell to the end user. But this $300 will not count the end user. The companies are going to use this $300 or dollars oranges to produce the orange juice. And in that case, they can produce like $500 of orange juice. And sell this orange juice in the market to the consumer. So in that case, this $500, that's the final good. And that final goods we're going to sell to the consumers, that's the end user. This $500 will count as the GDP. And this $300, the reason why it doesn't count, just because this $500 include this $300. If you count this $300 from the farmers to companies, and also count this $500 from companies to consumers, then the total GDP would be $800. That's incorrect because you count this 300 twice. So only the end goods or the final goods. All right. Next part is goods and services. All final goods and services. So GDP includes tangible goods like food, mountain bikes, beer, anything you can see it, you can touch it, that's the tangible. But also the intangible service, like dry cleaning, concerts, and haircut. But so again, all the goods should be legal goods, right? It cannot count as illegal, still as a heroin. Although that's tangible good, but since that's illegal, you cannot count it as GDP. Produced. GDP includes currently produced goods, not goods produced in the past. So we can see an example together. When Ford produces and sells a new car, the value of the car is included in the GDP. But when I sell my 2014 Ford Focus to my cousin, Che, for $4,000, the value of the used car is not included in the GDP. So our GDP will count the currently production. It's not count the product you buy or you produced before. Back to the example like orange juice company. Orange juice company. Last example, I said like that company buys 300 orange juice from the farmers and sell $500 as the orange juice to consumers. But what if in this case the company doesn't sell like all of its products 500 to consumers, only sell like $4,800 and the other $20 that company couldn't sell? What will happen? So in this case, the $500 is the GDP currently produced within this year. So all of these $500 will count as GDP. So $4,800 as consumption, and this another 20 as inventory. So in the GDP, we count it as our investment or inventory. This part is still count as GDP. Although I sell this another $20 next year, but it will not count the GDP next year. That's only this year, because I produce it this year. All right, currently it's important. Again, you should distinguish like what kind of product or service you do this year, and what kind of goods and services you provide the year before in the past, right? So only current year is the GDP. Within a country, GDP measures the value of production that occurs within a country's borders. So GDP just everything within the country, whether done by its own citizens or by foreigners located there. Gross national product, that's the definition of GNP. It's an estimate of total value of all the final product and services turned out in a given period of meaning period by the means of production owned by a country's residents. So please distinguish these two definitions. For GDP, it should be all product within the country. But for GNP, it's all residents. For example, I'm Chinese, so I teach here. I earn US dollars as payoff. So my payoff will include in GDP or GNP. But first of all, the GDP in the US, right? Since I do my job here in the US, so no matter what seasons I belong to, but I work here, I earn money here. My payoff should count as GDP in the US, but not in China's GDP. But my payoff will count as Chinese or China's GNP because I'm a Chinese resident. My payoff, my revenue would be the GNP for China, but not for the American, since I'm not American, right? So please distinguish these two definitions. Do not get confused with these two. The next part I want to emphasize is in a given period of time. So usually you can see like the Fed or the US government release the GDP every quarter and every year. So which means the GDP could measure as a quarter or yearly. Quarter is 3 months, right? So you can see two GDP. One is quarterly, the other is yearly. Back to this example, Nella and James. So what happens with the GDP? That's the question. We already know that for expenditures, increase is $50. And for income, also increases $50. So what happens with GDP here? Increase $50 or increase $100? It should be 50, right? Because the service or the good only value $50. That's what citizens or people produced within this year. That's only $50, not 100. So when you answer to the previous question change if Nella and James get married. If they get married, will GDP increase by $50? Why? Because you are not going to pay that exactly money, right? Yeah. If you can see no money, since they already get married, you can see no money transaction in that part. So that will not count as GDP. It's now left out of GDP because the service is no longer sold in the market. The component of GDP, this part is really important, all right? So recall, GDP is the total spending or income since they are kind of the same. You pay $1 and the other person have to receive that $1. So usually GDP is the total spending. There are 4 components. The first, consumption. The second, investment. Third, government purchases. The fourth one is net export. So this expression is important. Y equals to C plus I, investment, plus G, government purchases, plus NX, the net exports. So remember this expression. Let's see the 4 components one by one. Consumption, total spending by household on goods and services. But remember that doesn't include purchases of new housing. I'm going to explain this later. But please remember, for new housing, it will not include in consumption. It will include in GDP, but not in consumption in this part. Right? So the notes on housing cost for renters, C, the consumption includes a rent payment, which means you can value that per month or per quarterly. You can include that part as consumption. For homeowners, C includes in the imputed rental value of house, but not the purchases price or mortgage payment. Again, you can only measure your consumption for home or housing when you can measure them monthly or quarterly, but not as a whole price. That's important for consumption part. Investment here. Total spending on goods that will be used in the future to produce more goods. So for investment, usually it includes 3 parts. The first is business capital, including business structures, equipment, and the intellectual property products. So in this part, back to our definition, tangible good and intangible service, right? Business structure and intellectual property products, that's intangible, you cannot see. But still, you can use some money to value them. So that's also something you invent this year or you came up with. It has some value you can measure with the US dollars. So it's part of GDP. And also the equipment, which is tangible goods. It's also the basic capital. If you buy this kind of stuff for the future production, so it's the investment. And the second part is the reason why new housing is not part of consumption. Because for investment, the residential capital includes the landlord's apartment building, homeowner's personal residence. So in this part, if you buy a new home or housing, that counts as investment. You use home, such as if I'm a company, I buy a house to produce something. So that house, for me, is just for production. I need a room, I need some area to produce my product. So that house is the investment. What if I'm not a company, I'm just a household, but I need some area to sleep, to rest, right? And the reason why I need to sleep, to rest is I can have a better energy to produce more. So still, the house in that case is still the investment. I invested that to give me a better productivity or energy to do the production. So in this case, that's the reason why the new house is not a part of consumption, but that includes the investment. The last one is inventory accumulations, good produced but not sold yet. Like the example, like orange juice. For the orange juice companies, it produces $500 orange juice, but only sell or sold $490. So that's another $20 will be the inventory accumulations or investment here. This still counts as the GDP this year, but that's not the consumption, it's investment, because that's the inventory. The last one is important. Investment doesn't mean the purchase of financial assets like stock and bonds. So distinguish this definition in economics and finance. In finance, that's the investment, right? Because I want to invest my money into stock, into bonds, I want to get more benefit. But in this course, in GDP, it will not count or will not count as investment. Stock, bonds, they are not investment when we talk about GDP. Next part, G, is the government purchases. All spending on goods and services purchased by the government at the federal, state, or local level, they are all counts as the government spending or purchases. So that part counts as GDP. But that excludes transfer payments, such as the social security or unemployment insurance benefits. Why this will not count as the government purchases? This will not count as GDP. Imagine if we count this again, we will count this part twice. Why? Because this kind of benefits usually just for retired people or the people who need help, right? Usually they are not millionaires or whatever. So they get that amount of money, that benefit for food, for prescriptions, for service. They are going to spend them at the same time. So that amount of money will count as consumptions, right? If we have this part, that benefit count as consumptions and also as the government purchases, which means we are going to count that benefit twice. So that will overstate our GDP. In that case, we cannot include this part. We should exclude them. So the government purchases will only count that any spending, any good or service the government buy. If that's not government buy, then that's not a part of GDP. But it's still part of GDP, but including in different components. The last part is the net export. Net export equals to export minus import. So export definition, foreign spending on economies, goods and services. Import are the portion of C, I, and G that are spent on goods and services produced. So why we need to minus the import when we count or when we talk about GDP? Why we need to minus import? The same as consumption. Such as I want to buy a Toyota here. Like I spend like whatever $5,000 for a second-hand Toyota. That's sorry, I shouldn't use that example. I should buy a new car. Okay, $50,000 for a new Toyota here. That's part of consumption, right? That's part of GDP as consumption here because GDP equals to C. So that $50,000 is part of C. But it's not. But it's also the imports. So I should minus that part because that Toyota is not produced within the country, within the US, that's produced outside the US, I should minus that $50,000. So which means that part is not the GDP, because that Toyota is not produced in the US. In that case, we have to minus the import. And also in that case, we can make sure that our consumptions is the consumptions or the product or the goods and the services produced within the country, not outside of the country. So there are two reasons. First, why we need to minus this import. The first is it includes in the consumptions. And the second, imports is not the product produced within the country. So it's not a part of GDP. That's the reason why we need the net exports here. So the US GDP and its components in 2018. So again, this expression is important. Y equals to C plus I investment plus 2 government purchases plus net export. So in 2018, the total GDP was $20,500. So it includes C, consumption, investment, G, and net export. We can see that for the US imports more than exports, right? Because net export is negative. And the portion of GDP, and that's per person. Let's see this example together. So GDP and its components. So I'm going to write the expression here. So figure out what happens to A. Y equal to C equals to R plus G. Right, so if J Zara spends $300 to buy her husband dinner at a finest restaurant in Boston, so what part will GDP change, or will any part or component of GDP change? Consumption will increase, and what else? The GDP will also increase by $300, right? Because Y equals to C plus I plus G. If C increases by $300, so Y should also increase by $300. That's the answer for the first one. Let's see the second one. What part increase or decrease? What happened? So in this case, the investment increase because I need to use this stuff for more production for the business. So that counts as investment. Investment increased by $1,200. But since that product produced by China or built by China, so that counts as import. We should also minus that part. So I raises by that amount, but net export falls by that part. So as the total effect, the GDP will not change. Again, the definition for the GDP is all the products within the country. It will not include the product produced outside of this country. How about C? C is not a good example. You see that first, and then I'm going to show you the answer directly. Right. So Joseph spends $800 on tablet to use in his editing business. He got last year's model on sale for great price from a local manufacturer. So in this case, I and the GDP are unchanged. Why? Because this question is unclear, I think. For our investment raises by $800 because Joseph spent $800 for new stuff for production. That's the part of investment. But at the same time, he also sell an old model for the same $800. That part as the inventory. So which means he sells something from the inventory to others, which means the inventory decreases by $800. And the new investment with better amount of money by new stuff, so increases by $800. So the total effect would be unchanged. So both A and GDP are unchanged. How about D? What happens to the components? What happens to the GDP? Because again, that's the same as the orange juice companies, right? I produce this amount of product, so that's the GDP this year. But that could be divided into different parts. If I sell them to the consumers, that's the consumption, because consumers already paid the money for that product. But for the stuff I haven't sold it yet, it should be the part of the inventory. It still counts as GDP of this year, not next year. So that part is the investment. So the answer will be GDP rises by 500 million. The nominal GDP and real GDP. Values output using current prices, that's the nominal GDP. And that's not corrected for inflation. For real GDP, that's the value output using the prices of a base year. Is correct for inflation. So for the base year, your nominal GDP will equal to the real GDP. But for the other year, instead of the base year, usually the nominal GDP will not equal to the real GDP, especially when the price equals to each other. But usually that will not happen. Okay, here, compute the spending, the nominal GDP. So again, the nominal GDP, you are going to use the price for that specific year. The real price, the current price. So in this example, although we have one assumption that in this market, we only have two products, the pizza and chocolate. So we only have these two products as GDP. And we have different price and different quantity for different years. What's the nominal GDP here? So calculate. So this is easy, right? Since this asks you the nominal GDP, so you are going to use the price in that specific year. So when you calculate nominal GDP in 2019, you should use the price only in 2019. So 15 times the quantity, price in that year times the quantity at 7,000. Price in 2020, price is in 2021 the same. So you have three different numbers. How to calculate the increase rate? You use the second number, the nominal GDP in the second period, minus the nominal GDP in the first period, and divided by the nominal GDP in the first period. That's the increased price, the increased rate. The answer is over here. So when we talk about the nominal GDP, that's the increased rate. So we are going to use it later. Next part, try to calculate the real GDP and then use the base year of 2019. What's the result would be? The formula should be the same, but use different dollars, use different price, right? Because here you are going to calculate the real GDP. So if we want to calculate the real GDP, first of all, we need to figure out what year is the base year. That's really important here. So this question asks you 2019. So the prices you are going to use is only $15 and $2.50 here. So you use the base year's prices, but times the different quantities in different years, you are going to have the real GDP. That's the difference between the real GDP and the nominal GDP. So this part is important. And we can also find out the increase rate here. Again, use the value in the second period minus the price or value in the first period divided by the first period. So that's what we got from the previous example. For nominal GDP, we can see, you can call it like an increase rate or GDP growth rate or whatever, or inflation rate. Sorry, this is not inflation rate. My bad. It's either increase rate or GDP growth rate. So for nominal GDP growth rate, the increase rate is higher than the real GDP increase rate. The change in the nominal GDP reflects both price and quantity. Because when we calculate nominal GDP, we use the price in that specific year. So if the GDP, nominal GDP increase, which counts both the price change, price increases, and also the quantity increases. But when we calculate the change in the real GDP, it's the amount that GDP would change if the price were constant, which means the price keeps the same, no difference. But for the real GDP's increase rate, you only count the quantity change. What the quantity increases, what amount of quantity goes up or go up, whatever. That's the real GDP growth rate or real GDP increase rate. So that's the reason why for the increase rate of the real GDP usually higher than the nominal GDP. First of all, because the productivity will increase with technology, technological advance. So the quantity will increase year by year. That's the real GDP increases. For the nominal GDP increase compared with the real GDP increase rate, except the quantity part, also the price usually will go up by the time. That's the inflation, right? So for real GDP, usually we assume that there is zero inflation, only quantity change. Hence, real GDP is corrected for inflation. Real GDP is corrected for inflation, but nominal GDP isn't, because nominal GDP uses the current year prices. It's the nominal and the real GDP in the US from 1965 to 2019. So the red line is the real GDP. The base year is 2012, and the blue line is the nominal GDP. So the shaded areas are the period of recessions. So here, 2008, that's easier, right? It's easier to remember. That's the house or something. So the shaded area are recessions. Usually during recessions, we can see our GDP, no matter if it's real GDP or nominal GDP, it decreases by some amount. But for nominal GDP, back to our definition, right? For the nominal GDP and real GDP, when they equal to each other only when the base year. Only in the base year, the nominal GDP equals to our real GDP. So which means in this case, if the base year is 2012, then it's here. The nominal GDP will equals to real GDP. But before 2012, before the base year, usually the inflation is positive according to years, right? So the more earlier, the price level at that time should be lower, which means the nominal GDP should be lower, much lower than the real GDP. So which means back to 1970s, the nominal GDP, the difference between nominal GDP and the real GDP, the difference is much higher. And it gets smaller and smaller up until to the 2012, in that base year, the nominal GDP equals to real GDP. But after that, also because of the inflation, the nominal GDP will be bigger than the real GDP because the prices after 2012, the prices are higher than 2012. So according to this table, you can see if we choose different base year, the curve will be different. GDP deflator equals to nominal GDP divided by real GDP. Again, nominal GDP, we use the current price, but the real GDP, we use the price in your base year. But do not forget to times that 100, all right? So GDP deflator is a measure of price level, measures the current level prices relative to the level prices in the base year. Because nominal, the current price, and the denominator is the real, that's the prices in the base year. Economy's inflation rate compute the percentage change. So when we talk about inflation rate, that should be the percentage change. It's not just only change or something. You need to have the percent there. In the GDP deflator from 1 year to the next. So the bottom is the expression for the inflation rate for GDP deflator. So these two expressions are important in this part, and in both chapter 10 and chapter 11, we are going to have a huge amount of calculations. So this calculation is for chapter 10. Compute the GDP deflator in each year. So the expression is over here, the equation, like bar. So how to calculate the GDP deflator in 3 years. What's the inflation rate in 2020 and what's the inflation rate in 2021? So if you can remember these two expressions or equations, This is the easy calculation, right? The numerator just the nominal GDP in different years. So in 2019, that's the nominal divided by the real GDP. And also for 2020, still nominal is divided by the real 9,000. To calculate inflation rate, again, this is the percentage change. So in the numerator, you should have the difference, but the denominator should be the GDP deflator in the previous year or the year one. So that's the answer for this part. So 11.1% and 9.3. GDP and the economic well-being. So the real GDP per capita. The real GDP per capita, that's the main indicator of the average person's standard of living. So when we talk about the standard of living, we talk about the real, because the real is talk about the purchasing power. It's the quantity we care about, not the money. So, and also per capita is also really important because we cannot compare the GDP as a whole number between two countries. For example, we cannot compare like a GDP in China with GDP in South Korea. The GDP in China is higher than the GDP in South Korea, but the standard of living in China is not better than the standard of living in the South Korea. Just because the GDP per capita or real GDP per capita in South Korea is higher than the real GDP per capita in China. Right? So the real GDP per capita is the main indicator for our person's standard of living. But GDP is not a perfect measure of well-being because Robert Kennedy issues a very eloquent and harsh criticism of GDP. So exactly. So according to this paragraph, we can understand that if we use GDP measure everything, that's incorrect because there are lots of stuff that GDP cannot measure, right? What GDP doesn't value is the quality of the environment, the leisure time, the non-market activity, such as the child care a parent provide at home, or like all the work without money, like you do something for your friend, for your family, and so forth. And also the volunteer work, you cannot use money to value that. So that's still not part of GDP, but that could improve our people's standard of living, right? And the last indicator is the equitable distribution of income. These four factors are also very important in our society, but if we only use GDP as a measure, that's not good. So all in all, GDP is a good measure of economic well-being for most, but not all purposes. All right. So then, why do we still care about the GDP? Having a large GDP enable a country to afford something like better schools, a cleaner environment, healthcare. Many indicators of quality of life are positively correlated with GDP. So we can see some examples here. First is the GDP and the life expectancy in 12 countries. So the horizontal axis is the real GDP per capita. Again, this is the main indicator for our for people's standard of living. And the vertical axis is the life expectancy year. So you can see the relationship between these two variables. It's kind of like a concave curve, right? That's a positive relationship. When one country has a higher real GDP per capita, usually the life expectancy will get longer. As the countries would be Japan, Germany, and the United States. higher GDP per capita and longer life. Next example is the real GDP per capita versus the average years of schooling. That's education. Usually, country with higher GDP, they can use more money for the education to training their citizens, residents, something like that. And the relationship is kind of like a straight line, positive straight line. The last example is the overall life satisfaction. Again, the relationship is kind of like a straight line. But, the most important is the indicator, real GDP per capita is really important. That's what we usually use